Hilda Hertz, daughter of a Jewish leader of the Social Democratic Party in pre-war Germany, fled the Nazis with her family in 1933. She lived in Czechoslovakia, France, and England before arriving in the United States during World War II. Although she never attended high school, she passed equivalence exams and eventually graduated from Skidmore College in 1942. She earned her PhD from Duke University, married Morris Golden, and joined Kingsley Davis as a co-author of this 1954 article on urbanization and development, actually published the year before Davis's article on urbanization from our first week. She joined the sociology faculty at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst 8 years later in 1962 and taught there for a quarter century until her retirement. Hilda Hertz Golden died in 2012. This article examines the link between industrialization, economic development, and urbanization, showing that these processes tended to go hand in hand in many parts of the world and in many different time periods. In particular, Davis and Golden are most concerned about the issue of what problems might be caused if these parallel processes become unsynchronized from one another. For example, if cities grow faster than the expansion of non-agricultural urban jobs. They consider both causes and consequences of such a disconnect between these processes of social change. Kingsley Davis was on the faculty at Columbia University for part of his career. He organized a group to study population as part of the university's Bureau of Applied Social Research. With colleagues and graduate students in the group, he gathered data from countries around the world and used it to sketch out an international comparative picture of the process of urbanization. This article, published with Hilda Hertz Golden, is one of the research results of that larger project. Davis and Golden begin their article by clarifying the important difference between what they call the process of urbanization on one hand and the simple fact of urban population growth on the other. It is possible to have a very large city within a country that is not very urbanized. If we suppose that urban population is doubling over a period of 50 years, for example, we must also consider what is happening to the rural, non-urban population in the country. If the rural population also is doubling over a period of 50 years, then the growth rates of the urban and rural population are the same, and the share of people living in urban places will not change at all over that half-century. For Davis and Golden, urbanization is an increase in the proportion of the population that lives in urban places. They give an example to illustrate the difference between the two concepts. Quote, India has more people in cities than the Netherlands, but it is far less urbanized than the latter. Unquote. Even though India has more people in bigger cities, it also has an enormous rural population, many times bigger than that found in the Netherlands, and all those rural inhabitants keep the level of urbanization low in India. Of course, this distinction between urban and rural residents means that we need some kind of definition of who falls into each of these categories. Davis and Golden do not use personal characteristics of individuals to define them as urban or rural people. Instead, they look at the places themselves and define some places as urban centers or cities. All the people who live in those places are counted as urban, and everybody else in the population found outside those places is counted as rural. A person who moves from a farm to a city becomes urban in their definition, even though some habits of rural life may be hard to break. It can be tricky to decide on the boundary between urban and rural places. First, we have to decide how many people it takes to make a place urban. The first census of the United States in 1790 found that fully 95% of all U.S. residents lived on farms. The biggest city in the country was Boston, with only 25,000 people. The United States was still definitely a pre-industrial society when it first began. Given these small cities and most people living scattered across the countryside, the official U.S. Census definition of an urban place set the dividing line very low. Urban meant any place with more than 2,500 people. The second problem with deciding on the urban-rural boundary line involves exactly what we mean by a place. If you count up more than 2,500 farmers living on hundreds of different farms covering a large area, Does that allow you to call that area urban? This makes no sense. So the Census Bureau also requires that the urban definition also applies only to places that are officially, legally recognized as incorporated towns or cities with some kind of self-governing organizational structure recognized by the state in which these places are found. This legal recognition of an incorporated place is usually reserved for places where a significant number of people with non-agricultural occupations have gathered and settled. So urban in the United States applies to people living in a recognized, organized, non-agricultural community of at least 2,500 people. As the country moved on from its rural pre-industrial beginnings, and as cities grew rapidly and the pace of urbanization accelerated, this original dividing line became less and less sensible. Kingsley Davis and Hilda Hertz Golden tell us that it makes more sense to consider some alternative dividing lines, such as 10,000 people, or maybe even 25,000 people, or 100,000 people. They point out that it doesn't really matter which dividing line you use, because the distribution of urban places by size is pretty much a smooth, continuous distribution, without any big gaps or clear dividing points. The important thing for comparative international research is just to settle on some kind of defined rural-urban distinction, and then to stick to it consistently across countries. They settle on the boundary of places with at least 100,000 people, or sometimes 20,000 people, for counting urban places. Once we can define and measure urban and rural populations, we can calculate the percent urban for any population. When Davis and Golden do this, they notice right away that this level of urbanization seems to go hand in hand with another measure of a different feature of these societies, the level of economic development. Economic development is an incredibly complex topic involving the extent to which people use money for transactions rather than bartering goods and services, the kinds of occupations that people have, the level of wealth in the country, and even things like how much education people have and in what kind of families they live. But Davis and Golden stick to the basics in measuring development, just as they do for urbanization. They look at the kinds of occupations that people have, and in particular, at what share of the total labor force is working in agriculture. They calculate what they call the index of development for each country, which is actually just this percentage of people working in agriculture. The higher this percentage, the lower the index of development. As we already know from several articles about ancient cities, in most pre-industrial societies, at least 90% of the entire labor force had to be farmers, just to produce enough food for the society as a whole. Just as Davis and Golden were very conservative with their definition of urban as places with at least 100,000 people, they're equally conservative with their measure of developed versus underdeveloped countries. A developed country, according to their measure, has less than half of all workers in agriculture. If farmers represent 50% or more of the labor force in a country, Davis and Golden say the country is not developed. A clear relation of urbanization to development appears based on these measures. If we consider a graph based on the numbers from Table 2 in their article, we can see that the regions of the world with the highest percentages of workers in agriculture also have the lowest percentages of the population living in big cities. Moving to regions with lower and lower shares of farmers, we find rising shares of population living in big cities. Davis and Golden take this as a normal pattern, an inverse relation between agricultural employment and urbanization. By itself, this pattern indeed does seem quite normal, and even perhaps self-evident. But once they have established it, Davis and Golden go on to ask whether countries always follow this pattern. Davis and Golden show us that in general, a larger share of people in cities tends to go along with a falling share of people working in agriculture. They also point out some other things that tend to go along with urbanization, besides a change in the percentage of workers in agriculture. For one thing, the share of people in agriculture is not at all the same thing as the absolute number of farmers in a society. For example, suppose that the population of a country like the United States doubles from 50 million to 100 million people, as it actually did during the 1800s. Of the starting 50 million, 40 million, or 80% of the total, were farmers. Later on, of the 100 million, only 60% of all people are farmers, a decline of 20 percentage points for the percent in agriculture. But the 60% amounts to 60 million farmers, actually an increase of 20 million farmers at the same time that the percentage in agriculture was falling. Both urban and rural populations were increasing, even though cities were growing faster than the countryside. One of the interesting patterns noticed by Kingsley Davis was that as the percentage of people in cities rises, at some point the pull of the cities on the remaining rural population grows stronger than the capacity of the rural population to replace itself by having more children. He thought that this happens at about the point that a country reaches 50% urban, and for several reasons. First, a growing urban economy has a larger and larger demand for additional workers, pulling them from the countryside. Second, the appearance of tractors and other labor-saving technology also means that the rural demand for labor tends to fall, even as it is increasing in the cities. Finally, a country's overall birth rate, including the birth rate in rural areas, also tends to fall as the country urbanizes and modernizes, slowing the ability of rural populations to keep growing by natural increase. When the urban pull gets strong enough, the rural population begins to shrink in absolute numbers, not only as a percentage of total population. This rural population decline translates into falling population density in rural areas, something that can be observed in the history of the United States and other developed countries. In fact, interested observers have noticed that over the 20th century, the forests that covered the eastern United States prior to European colonial settlement, and that then were cleared away by farmers, have been coming back, overgrowing what used to be farmland in eastern states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and the New England states, as the rural farm population gradually disappeared into the cities. Davis and Golden point out that such rural depopulation is a natural side effect of urbanization and development. However, they go on to point out that this urbanization process can't go on forever. Obviously, the maximum possible percent urban for any population is 100%. And the actual limit to urbanization must be lower if anybody at all is to be left in the countryside to grow food for the rest. As the share of people left in rural areas gets smaller and smaller, their numbers are insufficient to keep cities growing at earlier rates, even if they were interested in moving. A graph in the article shows how increases in the urban percentage tend to slow down over time for countries already well into the process, such as England, the United States, or Canada. For these countries, the upward curve of urbanization flattens out over time. In the language of geometry, these curves are concave downward. At the same time, though, Davis and Golden noticed that while urbanization has been slowing down in such countries, it was actually accelerating in third world countries like India and Egypt. These curves rise faster and faster with each decade. They are concave upward. Naturally, Davis and Golden immediately wondered what might be causing this difference between slowing urbanization in some countries and speeding up of the shift into cities in other places. They tried to account for this difference by reconsidering the link between urbanization and the shift out of agriculture. Use the word industrialization when discussing shifting occupations, and as the figure shown here demonstrates, there is indeed a shift from farming to industrial jobs that went along with the urbanization process in places like the United States and the United Kingdom. In future discussions, we will see that it is not enough simply to compare industrial and agricultural jobs, because not every job outside agriculture can be called industrial. But for the purposes of this article, whenever Davis and Golden talk about industrialization, we need to keep in mind that what they really mean is the exodus from farming, without worrying too much about what kind of jobs all these ex-farmers are finding. This shift in occupations is a fundamental feature of economic development, because the shift usually is part of a larger picture of social change that also includes rising economic productivity in both the industrial and agricultural sectors, more output per worker, rising incomes, lower prices for more widely available products, and even social byproducts such as increasing literacy and rising levels of education. In the historical, mostly European cases that Davis and Golden think of as normal, all these transformations tended to happen together as part of an overall integrated process of social change. Urbanization itself was just one more facet of the overall process, linked to shifting occupations and rising levels of living. When looking at more recent examples of urbanization, where the trend has been accelerating rather than slowing down, Davis and Golden ask first of all whether it is still part of such an overall process of development, whether urbanization in these places is matched by the other trends, such as the shift out of agriculture and into city jobs and industry. They look around the world, using the data assembled at Columbia University as part of their research project, to see whether urbanization is still connected to what they call industrialization in places like India, Egypt, or Africa, in the same way that urbanization was just one part of an integrated process of development in earlier historical examples taken mainly from Europe. The first developing country example chosen by Davis and Golden, representing South Asian societies, is India. They have data for the percent of people in India who were living in cities as of 1950, although this time they include cities of 20,000 or more rather than only those with 100,000 or more. They also have information about the occupations of people in the labor force in India, so they can calculate the percentage of all workers found in agriculture. Then they can compare these two numbers. But how are they to judge whether the two numbers they have calculated fit each other or are out of alignment? How can they decide whether India is over-urbanized or not, given its level of employment in agriculture? There has to be some standard accepted as the normal relation between these two numbers in order for us to see whether the case of India is normal or very strange. For their India example, Davis and Golden can simply borrow some results from a research paper that Robert Park Jr., a Columbia graduate student, had recently presented at a scientific conference. That paper ranked all the countries of the world from the least urbanized to the most urbanized. India, one country on the list, had a rank pretty much in the middle of the pack. Park also then ranked all these countries from the lowest level of literacy to the highest, from the lowest per capita income to the highest, from the lowest share of workers outside agriculture to the highest, and the density of agricultural settlement, this time from the highest to the lowest instead, because low numbers of farmers per square mile of farmland was assumed to result from more efficient modern farming. With all these rankings of countries along several different dimensions of economic development, Park simply compared a country's ranking on one dimension to the ranking on another. For example, weighting the countries by their population size, India comes out at the 51st percentile for non-agricultural employment, and the 59th percentile for urbanization. These rankings for the two different dimensions of development are not all that different. In fact, India ranked somewhere between the 50th and 60th percentile on 4 out of the 5 considered dimensions. This leads Davis and Golden to judge that although India still had a long way to go on all these measures, at least the country was ranked consistently across most of them. If the previous figure showed India's urban percentage rising rapidly, this implies that the share of workers outside agriculture also was rising at a similar rate, and that the country was not out of balance in this sense. The only exception to this generally consistent picture of progress on all fronts came for the ranking of literacy. India had far more illiterate people than would be expected, given the rankings on the other measures. Since rural populations are likely to include many illiterate people in most developing countries, one possibility in the case of India might be that an unusual share of the urban population also remained illiterate. Davis and Golden don't parcel out literacy figures between urban and rural areas in their rankings. They also have no explanation for why India's ranking on literacy is so much lower than for any of the other measures. It could be that the rigid caste system of India's society made it unusually difficult to extend programs of mass education downward from the former pre-industrial elites to the rest of the population, whether in rural or in urban areas. At any rate, Davis and Golden do not judge India to be over-urbanized in their international comparative perspective. When they turn to their second example, they reach strikingly different conclusions. This time they concentrate only on the link between percent urban and percent working outside agriculture, the key connection for their assumptions about an integrated process of economic development. Hilda Hertz-Golden herself used the same collection of international statistics that Davis student Robert Park Jr. had used for his rankings, but instead of simply ranking the countries, she calculated a linear regression equation using data from countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and France that had gone through the development process in a normal fashion in earlier historical times. At each point in their historical experiences, these countries provided her with figures for percents urban and percents outside agriculture. She lined up all the numbers for these countries for all the historical dates available and calculated that across all her examples, an increase of about 1% in the non-agricultural labor force was matched by about a 0.5% increase, actually 0.44%, in the percentage of the population living in cities over 100,000 people. In other words, cities grew about half as fast as the non-agricultural labor force. This seems reasonable because some of the non-agricultural workers probably continued to live in non-urban areas, providing other kinds of goods and services to the farmers still living out there. Against this statistical background, shown in the graph here as the blue bars of expected percentages urban for Egypt, based on the international pattern, Golden then juxtaposed the actual percentages urban observed in Egypt over the first half of the 20th century, shown as the red bars in the graph. In every decade, Egypt was more urbanized than would be expected based on the historical experience of other supposedly normal countries. Not only that, but the gap between observed and expected kept growing larger every decade. Davis and Golden concluded firmly that Egypt is over-urbanized and that it represents a pathological case in this respect. What was the matter with Egypt? Davis and Golden single out two problems, both of which they suspected of creating a push out of the countryside toward the city. This rural push was added on top of any urban pull caused by economic development and the growth of industrial jobs in cities. The first problem for Egypt is that only about 4% of the country's total land area is arable, that is, suited for growing crops. Only the land close to the Nile River, rich with flood deposits of alluvial soil and close enough to the river to allow irrigation agriculture, can be farmed. As the rural population grows, they all end up crowded together in the same limited original territory. The second problem for Egypt, cited by Davis and Golden, is a backward system of land tenure, with most of the farmland owned by absentee landlords who live in the city and pay the actual rural farm families just barely enough to keep them alive. This means that the rural farm population has virtually no money for any kind of discretionary spending. So, as Davis and Golden put it, everybody who's not actually a farmer takes off for the city. Nobody can make a living doing anything but farming in the countryside because the farmers themselves have no money to buy any other kinds of goods and services. Compare this with Golden's regression results, predicting that roughly half the growth of the non-agricultural labor force normally would be expected to take place outside the cities, and it is easy to see why Egypt ended up over-urbanized. To make matters worse, Davis and Golden also believe that, quote, not only do productive non-agriculturalists come to the cities in Egypt, but also a great many unproductive people, unquote. They do not mean that the people are lazy or wicked, but simply that they're not fitting into urban industrial jobs. Who are all these unproductive people, and how do Davis and Golden know that they're coming to Cairo and other cities? There's an old saying that old demographers never die. They're only broken down by age and sex. Demographers enjoy this pun very much because data on age and sex often form the heart and foundation of their research and their insights into the human condition. This paper by Davis and Golden is no exception. Their first clue comes when they look at the age pattern of the urban population in Egypt and find that it looks very much like the overall age pattern of the country. This might sound fine to the average observer, but they find this very strange, because in the so-called normal experience of development in European countries in earlier historical times, as already clearly shown by Williamson, Urbanization tended to concentrate young adults at the prime working ages into cities, the people who are being pulled into the cities to work in the new industrial jobs. The absence of this young adult concentration is the same clue for Davis and Golden as was the dog in the night for Sherlock Holmes. The fact that the dog did not bark in the night meant to Holmes that the intruder was no stranger. The fact that the Egyptian cities were not filled with young adults meant to Davis and Golden that a lot of old people and little children were piling up in the cities of Egypt along with the young workers, old people and little children who were not likely to be working in industrial jobs. In the same way, they noticed that while early industrialization and urbanization tended to produce cities with an unbalanced sex ratio due to an excess of young men working in the early British or French or Belgian factories, the sex ratio of Egyptian cities was balanced. Women as well as men were coming to the city pushed by rural poverty and overpopulation rather than pulled by the economic expansion of the city itself, despite the fact that most women in Egypt were not in the paid labor force. This is the essence of what they consider to be over-urbanization. More people in cities than can be justified by the share of non-agricultural workers in the labor force. Davis and Golden have less to say about their African example, partly because they don't have very good statistics for most countries on the African continent, and they can't employ their sharp-edged Iron Age statistical weapons there. They are content in this case to document extremely rapid growth of urban populations. And since the population density of Africa was and is lower than that of most other continents, this also means extremely rapid urbanization of populations. They recognize three special features of the African settings they study. First, low population density in Africa means that cities will not be flooded by a tidal wave of farmers leaving a densely settled agrarian countryside. So they have a chance to avoid one of the most difficult development problems faced by cities in more crowded parts of the world. Second, the impact of foreign capital investment as a driver of economic development has been more dramatic in Africa than anywhere else on Earth. For Davis and Golden, this means that there is at least the potential for non-agricultural employment to grow at least as fast as urbanization, and possibly even faster, so that urbanization can be understood as resulting from a pull to the cities, as it was in Europe, rather than as a push from the overpopulated, impoverished countryside. So it is possible that when reliable statistics appear, the connection between percent urban and percent in non-agricultural jobs in Africa may look more normal as in India rather than over-urbanized as in Egypt. However, Davis and Golden finish their examples by pointing out that this kind of balance is not the only challenge faced by a rapidly urbanizing society. They mention the sharp contrast between traditional tribal cultures, still in many ways following a Neolithic model, and the urban industrial context of new transforming cities. Quote, "The result is a weird and chaotic mixture, which gives to the average African city an unreal, tense, jangling quality." Unquote. This article raises the issue of uneven progress in different dimensions of social change and development, one of which is urbanization.